A Raggedy Ann doll sat on a bed in Middletown, Connecticut, in the autumn of 1970, its red yarn hair catching the low amber light from a bedside lamp, its stitched smile fixed and soft, and exactly as it had been placed. The bedding beneath it was plain. The room around it was the kind of room that nursing students lived in, modest, functional, not quite furnished, and not quite bare, with the particular quality of a space that is used and slept in rather than arranged. The doll was second-hand, purchased from a hobby store by a mother who thought it would make a good birthday gift for her daughter, and it had that quality that second-hand soft toys carry without announcing it. A slight looseness in the fabric, a warmth in the cotton stuffing that came from having been handled before, a lived-in quality that new toys do not have. It was a gift meant kindly. It arrived in the room without ceremony. The daughter's name was Donna Johansson. She was a nursing student, practical by training and by inclination, living with a roommate named Angie in a small apartment in Middletown, Connecticut, in a year when both women were early enough in their studies that the texture of their days was made of classes and clinical hours, and the particular fatigue of learning something demanding with the body as well as the mind. The apartment was the kind of place that belongs to a specific chapter of a life, temporary by design, functional by necessity, held together by the combination of whoever had furnished it before and whatever the two women had brought with them. The doll arrived into this setting as a domestic object among domestic objects, a gift from a mother to her daughter in the ordinary way of such things, and Donna placed it on her bed because that was where soft toys went and did not think about it again in any particular way. Raggedy Ann was not an unusual thing to receive as a gift in 1970. The character had existed for over 50 years by then, introduced commercially in 1918, and a fixture of American childhood in the decades that followed. Soft fabric construction, approximately 18 inches tall, red yarn hair, stitched face, striped body, the kind of object so thoroughly absorbed into the background of domestic life that it produced no second glance from anyone who passed it on a shelf or found it propped against a pillow. Its face was designed to be gentle. The stitched smile was a fixed thing, unchanging, the same regardless of the angle from which it was observed, the kind of expression that belongs to objects rather than to people. Donna's doll was consistent with models widely available in the late 1960s and early 1970s. There was nothing about it that distinguished it from any other Raggedy Ann of its era. No physical feature that would have drawn any particular attention in any other context. It was simply a doll. It sat on the bed. The lamp beside it was low and warm, and the yarn of its hair held the light in the way that red yarn holds light, with a soft and undramatic glow. The first thing that Donna and Angie reported was small, and it concerned precisely this image, the doll on the bed, the lamp beside it, the room otherwise familiar and undisturbed. Within days of the doll's arrival in the apartment, both women found themselves looking at it differently, not because anything dramatic had occurred. The particular quality of the noticing was quieter than that. It was the kind of attention that sharpens gradually around something that cannot quite be placed, the way a person will return to the same corner of a room several times without being certain what it is they are checking. What they reported, and what was later documented in Gerald Brittle's 1980 account of the case, The Demonologist, was that the doll appeared to have shifted position, a turned head, a repositioned arm, the angle of the body slightly different from how it had been placed the night before. Neither woman could say with certainty that she had not moved it herself. In the absent way that a person straightens things without registering the action, neither woman could say with certainty that she had. The reports of this kind accumulated over days, and then over weeks, and the quality of the two women's attention to the doll changed in a corresponding way, becoming more deliberate, more careful, the kind of attention that is the opposite of the absent rearranging of domestic objects. Donna and Angie began placing the doll in specific positions and noting what they observed when they returned to the room. According to their accounts, as recorded in The Demonologist, the doll continued to appear in positions that differed from how it had been left. A head turned toward the door when it had been facing the wall. An arm raised slightly when both arms had been resting at the doll's sides. The changes were not dramatic. They were small enough to be uncertain about, small enough to explain in any number of ways, and yet consistent enough in their pattern that both women found themselves uncertain in a way that was difficult to resolve. There is a particular quality to that kind of uncertainty. It is not alarming in the way that clear and dramatic events are alarming. It is quieter than that, a slow, low, persistent sense that something in one's ordinary environment has developed a property it did not previously have, that a familiar object has become unfamiliar in a way that cannot quite be named. Donna and Angie were nursing students. They were people trained to observe carefully, to record accurately, to distinguish between what they had observed and what they had inferred. The quality of their attention to the doll, as it comes through in the documented account, was not panicked or sensational. It was the careful attention of people who had noticed something they could not account for and were trying to understand what they had noticed. The two of them would stand in the doorway of the bedroom, both of them there, both of them looking, and discuss quietly whether the angle of the doll's head had changed since the last time they had looked at it. The apartment around these conversations was ordinary in every other respect. The kitchen table was functional. The windows looked out on a Middletown street in 1970, and the Connecticut River lay a few miles off in the dark beyond the town, as it always had, unhurried and wide. The autumn was settling into the kind of cool and still that Connecticut autumns carry, and the light in the evenings came early and went quickly, so that the interior of the apartment, the lamp by the bed, the warm light of the kitchen, was more present than it had been in summer. The building they lived in was a modest rental, the kind of building that houses nursing students and young professionals and people in the particular transitional chapter of a life when the permanent arrangements have not yet been made. From the outside, on a still autumn evening, its windows would have been lit from inside, like any other building on any other street. Nothing unusual about them, nothing that would have drawn a second glance from anyone passing on the road below. The doll's movements, if that is the right word for what was reported, were always discovered rather than witnessed. Neither Donna nor Angie ever reported seeing the doll in the process of changing position. They would leave the room and return, and the doll would be as it was, or it would be subtly different from how it had been, and the transition between those two states was never observed directly. This is a detail worth dwelling in for a moment, because it is part of what made the situation so difficult to resolve. There was no moment of clear evidence, no irrefutable instance that settled the question in either direction. There was only the doll as it had been placed, and the doll as it was found, and the space between those two states in which neither woman had been present to observe what, if anything, had occurred. Gerald Brittle's account in The Demonologist, published 10 years after these events, drew on interviews with Ed and Lorraine Warren, who had in turn spoken at length with Donna, Angie, and the other people involved in the case. The book is the primary narrative record of what Donna and Angie reported experiencing, and it is worth approaching that record with the same care that Donna and Angie applied to the doll itself, noting what is documented, what is reported, and what remains a matter of account rather than established fact. What Donna and Angie reported is documented. What produced what they reported is a separate question, and one that has not been formally resolved. The doll's apparent movements continued, and then something else was reported, something of a different kind. Donna and Angie found notes in the apartment, small pieces of paper, handwritten, bearing brief messages. The specific phrases recorded in the demonologist were two: help us and help Lou. Lou was the name of a male friend who visited the apartment regularly, someone close to both women, a familiar and frequent presence in that Middletown space. The notes themselves were described as being written on parchment-style paper, the kind of paper with a texture and quality that distinguished it from ordinary notebook paper or printer paper, the kind of paper that one might use for a letter or a formal document. Both Donna and Angie stated, according to the account in the demonologist, that they did not own paper of that kind. The handwriting on the notes was described as rounded and childlike. The phrases themselves were short, 3 words, 2 words, brief in the way that a message written quickly or written by someone uncertain of the language is brief. Help us, help Lou. The notes were found on the kitchen table, on surfaces in the apartment, in places where they had not been before. The circumstances of their appearance were not explained by either woman. They could not account for how the notes had come to be where they were found, any more than they could fully account for the doll's apparent movements. The apartment had not been broken into. The door had been locked. The windows had been closed. It is worth sitting with the specific image of the kitchen table in that Middletown apartment. Plain, functional, the ordinary surface of 2 nursing students' shared domestic life, covered at any given moment with the objects of that life, textbooks and cups and keys, and whatever else accumulates on kitchen tables. And then one day, on that same table, a small piece of parchment-style paper with rounded writing on it, the rest of the table surface bare and ordinary around it. The strangeness of the notes was not in the messages themselves, which were simple and short. It was in the paper, and in the fact that neither woman could place the paper in their apartment, and in the quiet persistence of the situation, the doll, and now the notes, and the sense that something in the space around them had become attentive in a way that domestic spaces are not supposed to be attentive. Lou was the name written on one of the notes. He was real and present, a regular visitor to the apartment who knew both women well and was aware, by this point, of what they had been reporting about the doll. His experience of the situation had a different quality from Donna's and Angie's. His connection to the apartment was the connection of a visitor rather than a resident, someone who entered the space and left it, who did not sleep there. And it was Lou who reported something more specific than either of the 2 women had described up to that point. He reported waking, on one occasion, to find scratches on his chest that he could not account for. The scratches were described as claw-like in character, several parallel marks on the skin, of the kind that might be produced by contact with something with a narrow, sharp edge. He had no explanation for them. He had not been aware of injuring himself. The marks were simply there when he woke, present on his skin without a source he could identify. Ed and Lorraine Warren, in their later documentation of the case, cited Lou's account of the scratches as evidence of what they described as escalating physical activity associated with the doll, a pattern in their framework of reported events that intensified in specificity over time. That framework, and the Warrens' conclusions about it, belongs to a later chapter of the case, and the shape of their interpretation will emerge in its own time. What Lou reported is simpler to hold at this stage of the account: marks on his skin that he had not inflicted on himself and could not explain, discovered on the morning after a night spent in or near the Middletown apartment, where the doll and the notes had already been present for some weeks. The account is recorded. The explanation, if there is one, is not. The Connecticut River flowed a few miles from that apartment, as it had always flowed, and the town around the building where Donna and Angie lived was going about its ordinary autumn business. And inside the apartment, the situation had by now developed a quality that neither woman had sought and neither could quite set aside. The doll on the bed, the notes on the table, Lou's account of the marks on his skin, none of these things taken individually produced an easy explanation. Taken together, they had accumulated into something that the two women found themselves wanting to understand more fully. And they did what people who want to understand things that resist ordinary explanation often do. They looked for someone who might have a framework for what they were experiencing. Before they contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren, Donna and Angie consulted a medium. Her name was Patty Donovan, and the account of what she told them is recorded in The Demonologist. According to the book, Patty Donovan conducted a reading in the apartment and offered an explanation for what Donna and Angie had been experiencing, an explanation rooted in her practice and her interpretation of what she sensed in the space. What she told them, as recorded, was that the doll was inhabited by the spirit of a young girl. The name she gave for this spirit was Annabelle Higgins. The story, as Patty Donovan presented it, was that Annabelle Higgins had died on the property where the apartment building now stood, that she was a girl who had not moved on, who remained connected to the land, and who had been drawn to the doll as a vessel. The medium told Donna and Angie, according to the account in The Demonologist, that Annabelle wished to remain with them, that she was not malevolent, that she sought only to be in their company. This is what Patty Donovan told Donna and Angie, and what Donna and Angie reported having been told. It is not established as fact in any other sense. There is no historical record of a girl named Annabelle Higgins associated with the property, no documentation of a death on the land that can be independently verified, no corroborating evidence for the medium's account beyond the account itself. What can be said with confidence is that this is what Patty Donovan communicated in the apartment in Middletown in 1970 or thereabouts, and that Donna and Angie found some comfort in the explanation. The idea of a child's spirit, benign and simply seeking company, was more tolerable than a range of other possible framings. They did not, according to the documented account, immediately attempt to remove the doll or contact anyone outside the small circle of people who already knew about the situation. The name Annabelle Higgins. It is a specific name, a particular name, the kind of name that attaches to a person rather than to a concept, and it attached itself to the doll in the telling of the medium's account, and has remained attached to it since, through all the subsequent retellings and investigations and documented interviews. Whether the spirit of a girl named Annabelle Higgins ever inhabited that apartment on that property in Middletown, Connecticut, is not a question that has been answered. It is part of what Patty Donovan reported sensing and what Donna and Angie reported having been told, and those two facts are what they are, accounts from specific people at a specific moment, recorded and preserved, and neither confirmed nor refuted. The doll continued to sit on the bed in the apartment. The yarn of its hair was red, and the light from the bedside lamp was warm, and the stitched smile was unchanged, as stitched smiles are always unchanged, fixed in the fabric by a process that has nothing to do with mood or circumstance. The doll was 18 inches tall and soft to the touch, and had been purchased second-hand from a hobby store and given as a birthday gift, and all of those things remained true regardless of what was being reported about it. It was an object. It sat in a room. The room was in Middletown, Connecticut, in the autumn of 1970, and outside the window, the town went on with its ordinary business, and the Connecticut River lay in the dark a few miles away, wide and slow and indifferent to what was happening inside the modest rental building on the street. The quality of attention that Donna and Angie had developed toward the doll by this point was different from the absent domestic attention with which most people occupy their spaces. It was a watchful quality, careful and sustained, the kind of attention that does not relax fully, even when directed at other things. They knew where they had placed the doll each time they left the bedroom. They registered its position when they returned. The uncertainty they had been living with was not traumatic. It had not produced any crisis, had not overwhelmed the ordinary daily structure of their lives, had not announced itself in any way that was visible from outside the apartment. It was simply there, in the background of their shared domestic life, the way that unresolved questions are there, persistent, low, returning whenever the relevant object or space came back into view. The notes, "Help us" and "Help Lou" were a different quality of reported event. The doll's apparent movements could be accommodated, however uneasily, within the range of things that might have an ordinary explanation, however difficult that explanation was to name. The notes were harder to accommodate in the same way. Neither woman owned paper of that kind. The messages were written in a hand that neither recognized. The apartment had been secure. These were the facts as Donna and Angie reported them, and the facts as recorded in the demonologist, and they constituted a reported situation for which no mundane explanation was offered in the account, and none has been publicly established since. The parchment-style paper was a specific detail, and it is worth returning to it. The texture of it, the quality of it, the way it differed from the ordinary paper that a nursing student's apartment would contain, the way it did not belong to the inventory of the space. Paper of that kind was not something that simply appeared in a domestic environment. It was the kind of paper that came from somewhere, from a specific purchase, from a specific source, and neither woman could identify such a source in their apartment or in their recent memory. The notes were there, the paper was real, the writing was present and legible, and the women who found them could not say how they had come to be where they were. "Help us, help Lou." The first phrase suggested more than one person or more than one presence, and the plural was noted in the documented account without being fully explained by the medium's later attribution of the activity to a single spirit. "Help Lou" suggested knowledge of a specific person by name, a person who was real and present in the apartment's social world. Lou was real. He had scratches on his chest that he could not account for. His name was on the paper. The specific, named quality of the second note gave it a different weight from the first. It was not a generalized appeal, not a vague expression of distress, but something directed, something addressed to the particular circumstances of the apartment and the people in it. The apartment in Middletown was not unusual in any external way. It was a student apartment in a modest rental building in a Connecticut town in 1970, the kind of place that housed the particular chapter of a life defined by training and formation and the years before the permanent arrangements were made. The autumn outside was cool and still. The Connecticut River was a few miles off, as it had always been. Inside, 2 nursing students and a Raggedy Ann doll, and a collection of reported events that had accumulated over weeks into something that neither woman could explain away, and that had now acquired the additional layer of a medium's account and a name, Annabelle Higgins, attached to the spirit that the medium reported sensing in the doll. There is something in the simplicity of the object itself that the account keeps returning to, and that repays the returning. A Raggedy Ann doll, second hand, soft fabric construction, red yarn hair, stitched smile, approximately 18 inches tall, purchased from a hobby store and given as a birthday gift by a mother to her daughter. There is nothing about that description that would give anyone pause in any ordinary context. It is among the most familiar and unthreatening objects in the American domestic landscape of the 20th century, the kind of toy so thoroughly absorbed into the background of childhood that it registers as safe without being considered, as benign without being examined. The doll on the bed in Donna's room was that object. It sat in the low lamplight with its red yarn hair and its fixed expression, and the soft weight of its stuffed fabric body resting against the pillow. And it was exactly what it appeared to be, and it was also, by this point, in the autumn of 1970, the center of something that neither of the women in the apartment could quite name or resolve. The medium had given them a name, Annabelle Higgins, the name of a girl who had in the medium's account died on the land where they lived. The name settled onto the doll the way names settle onto objects in a household, quietly, without fanfare, becoming the way the object was referred to, the way it was thought of. The doll was no longer simply a Raggedy Ann. In the language of the apartment, in the conversation between the two women, and Lou, and the small circle of people who knew about the situation, it had become Annabelle. That naming is documented. It is part of the record of what occurred in that apartment in that year. Whether what the medium reported sensing in the doll was real, in the way that she believed it was real, is a question that the record does not answer. The documented account of the Middletown apartment covers a period of roughly several months in 1970, during which the reported incidents, the apparent movements of the doll, the notes, Lou's account of the scratches, accumulated to the point where Donna and Angie felt the situation had moved beyond what they could manage within the framework of the medium's reassurances. The spirit of Annabelle Higgins, as Patty Donovan had described her, was supposed to be benign, a child spirit seeking company, not a threatening presence. And yet the situation in the apartment had not resolved. The doll continued to be found in positions that differed from how it had been placed. Lou had his scratches. The notes had been found. The medium's framework had provided a name and a narrative, but not a settled feeling, and not an end to what was being reported. The building's exterior, on any of those still autumn evenings, would have presented nothing unusual to anyone passing on the street below. The windows were lit from inside in the ordinary way of inhabited buildings at night. The modest rental structure was unremarkable in every external respect. No feature of it that would have suggested to a passing observer anything other than the ordinary residential life of a Connecticut town in 1970. Inside, a Raggedy Ann doll with red yarn hair and a fixed, stitched smile was sitting on a nursing student's bed in a position that may or may not have been the position in which it had been placed. And two women were living with the quiet and persistent uncertainty of that fact. And elsewhere in the apartment, a small piece of parchment-style paper bearing rounded childlike writing had been found on a surface where it had not been before. The notes exist in the record because Donna and Angie reported them, and because Gerald Brittle included their accounts in The Demonologist in 1980. The parchment paper exists in the record because both women stated they did not own it and could not account for its presence. The phrases on the notes, "help us" and "help Lou," exist in the record as specific documented details, specific enough in their wording that they have been cited in every subsequent account of the case that draws on the primary source. They were found. They were there. The paper was real enough to be held and read. The writing was legible enough to be transcribed and preserved. What put the notes on the table in the Middletown apartment in the autumn of 1970 is not established. The question sits open in the record, the way unresolved questions sit open, not urgently, not loudly, but with the particular persistence of something that has not been explained and has not gone away. The doll was on the bed, the notes were on the table, the lamp was warm and low. The red yarn hair caught the light in the ordinary way that red yarn catches light, and the stitched smile was fixed and unchanged, and the apartment was quiet around the object that was sitting in it, and the Connecticut River moved in the dark a few miles off from everything that was being quietly reported in that small and ordinary room. Ed Warren was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut in 1926, and Lorraine Warren was born in Bridgeport a year later in 1927. They had been married since 1945. They were, in the most ordinary sense, a couple from southwestern Connecticut who shared a house in Monroe and had spent their adult lives doing something that did not have an obvious professional category, investigating reports of paranormal activity in private homes, in churches, in public buildings, in any place where someone believed something had happened that could not be accounted for by ordinary means. By the time they arrived in Middletown in the early 1970s to meet Donna Johansson, her roommate Angie, and their friend Lou, they had been doing this work together for more than 2 decades. Ed Warren described himself as a self-taught demonologist. That word carries different weight depending on who is using it and where, and it is worth holding it in its exact context. Ed Warren operated within the framework of the Roman Catholic Church, and the term as he used it referred to the study of demonic entities as understood within that theological tradition. He had not been credentialed by any academic institution in this field. He had read extensively, he had investigated hundreds of cases, and he had arrived at a set of conclusions about how non-human entities behaved, how they selected their targets, and how they could be addressed. Those conclusions are documented in detail in Gerald Brittle's 1980 book, The Demonologist, which was written with full cooperation from Ed and Lorraine Warren, and which serves as the primary written record of their investigative framework and their case files up to that point. Lorraine Warren described herself as a clairvoyant and a light trance medium. She reported being sensitive to the emotional and spiritual residue of places and objects in ways that went beyond ordinary perception, and she brought that sensitivity to her work alongside Ed's more structured demonological analysis. Together they formed what they described as a complementary investigative partnership, his framework providing the theological and procedural structure, her perception providing a different kind of access to what was present in a given space or object. Whether that partnership produced reliable results was a question different observers answered differently. What is documented is that they worked consistently and for a very long time, and that the cases they investigated accumulated into one of the more extensive private archives of paranormal case files in the northeastern United States. Monroe is a quiet town in Fairfield County, about an hour's drive southwest of Middletown along the Connecticut roads. The Warrens' home there was modest, a private residence on a residential street, not a facility, not an institution, simply a house where 2 people lived and worked and kept, over the years, a considerable collection of objects related to the cases they had investigated. The drive from Middletown to Monroe is not a long one. On a clear day, through the middle of Connecticut, it takes less than an hour, but it was not a short drive in terms of what it represented. It was the route by which the Annabelle doll eventually left the apartment where it had been acquired and the women who had kept it, and arrived in the possession of the people who would hold it for the rest of their working lives. When the Warrens arrived in Middletown to investigate the case, they spent time with Donna, Angie, and Lou. They listened to the accounts of what had been reported: the repositioned doll, the notes on parchment paper, the scratches that Lou had found on his chest. They walked through the apartment. Lorraine reported her impressions. Ed asked questions and took notes. The account of this meeting, as recorded in The Demonologist, presents it as a careful, methodical process, the Warrens conducting what they regarded as a thorough assessment of the situation before arriving at any conclusion. The conclusion they arrived at was specific, and it is worth following precisely rather than summarizing loosely. The Warrens did not agree with what the medium Patty Donovan had reportedly told Donna and Angie, that the doll was inhabited by the spirit of a young girl named Annabelle Higgins, who wished to remain with them. Ed Warren argued at length in The Demonologist and in subsequent interviews that this was precisely the kind of interpretation a demonic entity would encourage. A human spirit, in his framework, would not inhabit an inanimate object. The soul of a deceased child, as he understood the theology, would not attach itself to a Raggedy Ann doll and seek permission to remain in a student apartment. What he believed was present was something altogether different, not a human remnant, but a non-human entity, demonic in nature, that had selected the doll as a focal point and manufactured the sympathetic narrative about Annabelle Higgins precisely to lower the occupants' defenses and encourage them to welcome its presence. This distinction between haunting and infestation was central to the Warrens' entire investigative framework, and the Annabelle case was one of the clearest examples they cited of why the distinction mattered. A haunting, as they defined it, involved the lingering presence of a deceased human being. Infestation involved a non-human entity, a demonic presence, in their terminology, that was actively working to establish influence over a person or a space. The object itself in this reading was not haunted. It was occupied in a different sense, used as an anchor, a focal point, a means by which the entity maintained access to the people around it. The doll was not the source of the activity. It was, in the Warrens' account, the address. Ed Warren was careful to explain in The Demonologist that this distinction had practical consequences for how such a case should be handled. An attachment to a human spirit might call for a different spiritual response than an infestation by a demonic entity, and more immediately, the attachment that the occupants of the apartment had formed toward the doll, the sympathy generated by the Annabelle Higgins narrative, the sense that the doll contained a child who needed care was on this reading exactly the mechanism the entity was using to remain present and to deepen its influence. The story about the girl made the doll difficult to remove. The entity, as Ed Warren understood it, was aware of this. The three-stage model that the Warrens described in their framework moved from infestation to obsession to possession. Infestation was the first stage, the entry point, the establishment of presence, the initial contact. It could involve objects, spaces, or both. It could produce physical phenomena, sounds, sensations, the apparent movement of objects, without yet achieving direct influence over the people involved. The Annabelle case, the Warrens concluded, was at this stage. It had not progressed to obsession, which they described as a state in which the entity's influence began to affect the mental and emotional life of a specific person in sustained ways, nor had it reached possession. But Ed Warren stated directly in The Demonologist that the trajectory was clear. The entity was working towards something. Infestation left unaddressed was in his view a beginning, not an end point. Whether this framework accurately describes anything real is a question that the narration follows to the edge of and stops. What is documented is that Ed Warren held this view consistently across decades of interviews, that it is recorded in detail in a published work with his cooperation, and that it formed the basis on which he approached the case and decided what to do about the doll. The framework is his. The conclusions are his. They are presented here as his documented belief and methodology, held with the same careful, level attention given to everything else in this case. The Warrens arranged for a Catholic priest to come to the apartment. He is identified in Warren accounts as Father Cook. He arrived at the Middletown apartment and conducted a blessing of both the space and the doll. The account of this visit, as recorded in the Demonologist, notes something worth holding on to. Father Cook reportedly approached the situation with a degree of professional skepticism. His initial assessment, as Ed Warren recounted it, was that the matter was more likely psychological in origin than supernatural. He was not, in other words, arriving as a believer in the demonological reading. He was a priest performing a requested blessing, which is a specific and procedurally well-defined thing within the Catholic Church, and his personal view of the probable cause appears to have been provisional and cautious. That detail is worth dwelling on for a moment, not because it resolves anything, but because it places the event in a more layered context than a simple story of believing and acting on belief. Father Cook came. He performed the blessing. He was skeptical of the supernatural interpretation. All three of those things are true simultaneously in the account as Warren recorded it, and they exist alongside each other without canceling each other out. The apartment was blessed. The priest did not share the Warrens' conclusions about what was present. The blessing was performed regardless. After the blessing, in the Warrens' account, the situation did not resolve. The reported activity continued. Ed Warren concluded that the doll needed to be removed from the apartment entirely, not simply blessed in place, but taken out of the space and placed in a setting where it could be kept under appropriate conditions, monitored and enclosed. This was the Warrens' home in Monroe. The decision, as Warren described it, was not made lightly. He was aware that bringing such an object into a private home, his home, where he and Lorraine lived, was not without consequence. But it was the conclusion his framework pointed to, and he proceeded accordingly. Ed Warren carried the Raggedy Ann doll out of the Middletown apartment himself. He wrapped it and placed it in his car. He had with him, according to his account in the Demonologist, a small glass vial of holy water. He drove toward Monroe. The route from Middletown to Monroe takes the driver through the middle of Connecticut, through towns with names like Meriden and Southington and Cheshire, through the steady, quiet suburban geography of a New England state in the early 1970s. The road straightforward, the landscape unremarkable, a highway drive that most people would complete without incident and largely forget. Ed Warren reported that the drive was not unremarkable. He recounted in the Demonologist that the vehicle experienced difficulties during the journey, brake failures, problems with the steering that he could not account for mechanically. He described sprinkling holy water on the doll during the drive. The account is specific and consistent across multiple retellings. This is not a detail that shifted over time or became elaborated in later versions. It appears in the Demonologist as a particular memory, narrated plainly, without theatrical framing, in the matter-of-fact register that characterized much of Warren's documentation of his own casework. What to make of that account depends on what one brings to it. A mechanical explanation for brake difficulty on a Connecticut highway is not difficult to imagine. The fact that the difficulty coincided with transporting a doll that Ed Warren regarded as demonically infested is, depending on one's framework, either significant or irrelevant. The narration arrives at this point and holds both possibilities with equal steadiness. What is documented is that Ed Warren reported these experiences, that he recorded them in a published account with his name attached, and that they form part of the specific texture of how this doll arrived in Monroe. The journey ended. The car completed the drive. The Warrens' house on its residential street in Monroe received a new occupant, not a person, but a soft fabric doll with red yarn hair and a stitched smile, approximately 18 inches tall, indistinguishable to the eye from any other Raggedy Ann doll of its era. Ed Warren carried it through the front door. The house from the outside looked the same as it had looked the previous hour. A quiet street in a Connecticut town in the early 1970s. The lights on inside, the ordinary architecture of a suburban New England home, and somewhere inside its walls, a children's toy that had just completed a 60-mile journey in the possession of a man who believed it was occupied by something non-human. The Warrens did not immediately place the doll in the museum that would eventually house it. In the early period after the doll's arrival, according to Warren accounts, they kept it in the house proper. Lorraine Warren described, in interviews from various years, the sense of presence that she associated with the object during this early period, the impression of something active, something attentive within the fabric figure. She was careful in how she characterized these impressions, and that care is worth noting. She did not describe the doll as dangerous in the way one might describe a weapon. She described it as occupied, as containing something that had a quality of intention, or at least of directed attention. The difference in her framing is subtle, but it runs consistently through her accounts across decades. Ed Warren continued to develop his thinking on the case in the period following the doll's arrival. The Annabelle case became, in subsequent years, one of the most frequently cited examples in his lectures and public talks on demonic infestation, used to illustrate the specific mechanisms he had identified in his framework, the way an entity could attach to an object, manufacture a sympathetic identity, and work gradually toward deeper influence over the people around it. He was consistent in his description of the case as representing a clear, well-documented example of the infestation stage, and he cited the Annabelle doll as among the most clearly evidenced cases in his files. The Demonologist was published in 1989, or 10 years after the events in the Middletown apartment. Gerald Brittle, the author, worked closely with the Warrens in producing the book, and the Annabelle case appears in it as one of the extended case studies, detailed, specific, narrated in the Warrens' own voice, as rendered through Brittle's writing. The book became one of the primary vehicles by which the case reached a wider audience, and its account has remained the documentary foundation of the Annabelle story, as it has been told and retold in the decades since. It is worth pausing on what kind of document The Demonologist is. It is not a peer-reviewed account. It is not an official investigation report. It is a book written by a collaborating author based on extensive interviews with Ed and Lorraine Warren, presenting their version of their own cases in their own words, through a framework they themselves constructed over decades of work. That does not make it unreliable in the sense of being carelessly produced. It was clearly prepared with attention and with the Warrens' full cooperation. But its claims are the Warrens' claims. Its framework is their framework, and what it documents is what they believed and how they understood their own work. That is a meaningful and specific kind of document. It is simply not the same as an independent investigation. The Warrens had, by 1970, investigated what they described as hundreds of cases across New England and beyond. They had developed their framework through long practice and through sustained engagement with the theology and demonology of the Catholic Church, which provided the interpretive vocabulary and the procedural responses, the blessings, the holy water, the involvement of clergy that structured their approach. They were not casual enthusiasts. They were, within their own terms, serious investigators who had spent their adult lives engaged with these questions and who had arrived at settled convictions about what they were dealing with. Those convictions shaped everything about how they handled the Annabelle case. The decision to remove the doll, the route taken, the holy water carried in the car, the choice to keep the doll in Monroe rather than destroy it or return it. Ed Warren was asked on multiple occasions why the doll was not simply destroyed, burned, thrown away, dissolved in whatever medium might be thought to affect it. His answer, as recorded in various interviews, was consistent. Destroying the physical object would not address what was in it, and might, in his view, release the entity rather than containing it. The doll, maintained and enclosed and kept under what the Warrens considered appropriate conditions, was safer as an intact physical object than it would be as ash or fragments. This reasoning, that the enclosure of the object was a form of containment of the entity, governed the eventual disposition of the doll, which would come to rest behind locked glass in the Warrens' museum. But that development came a little later. In the immediate period following its arrival in Monroe, the doll was in the house, in the Warrens' care, in whatever room or corner Ed had designated for it, and the house continued its ordinary life around it. The quiet suburban streets of Monroe outside, the lights on in the evenings, the television perhaps, the meals, the accumulated domestic texture of a long marriage between two people who had spent decades looking carefully at things most people chose not to see. The Warrens were not the only people who investigated or commented on the case over the years. Various clergy, researchers, and other investigators encountered the doll and the Warrens' account of it. The consistent thread in Warren-adjacent accounts is that those who accepted the demonological framework found the case compelling. Those who did not accept it found it interesting as a study in perception, in the social dynamics of belief, or in the way a simple object could accumulate narrative weight over time. These are not mutually exclusive interpretations, and the narration holds both of them at the same level distance. The relationship between Ed and Lorraine Warren and the Roman Catholic Church was, by their own account, a close working one. They regularly involved clergy in their cases, arranged for church-sanctioned blessings of spaces and objects, and framed their entire methodology within Catholic theological terms. Several priests appear across their case files, not as primary investigators, but as participants in the procedural responses the Warrens arranged, performing blessings, offering prayers, occasionally providing their own observations on what they encountered. Father Cook in the Middletown apartment is one such figure. He came, he saw, he performed the blessing, he retained his skepticism. The blessing was performed, the skepticism was retained. Both things remained true. Ed Warren described himself in interviews as a practicing Catholic who regarded his demonological work as fully consonant with church teaching, not a fringe activity, but a legitimate exercise of a Catholic framework applied to specific cases. Lorraine Warren shared this framing. Their self-presentation was of two devout, careful people working within an established theological tradition, applying its tools to documented situations that they believed the tradition was specifically equipped to address. Whether the church formally endorsed their work or regarded it with more institutional distance is a question the documentary record does not clearly resolve. What the record does show is that the Warrens worked for decades in cooperation with clergy, on cases that involved reported paranormal phenomena, and that the Annabelle case, a used Raggedy Ann doll purchased at a hobby store in Connecticut, became in their telling one of the clearest examples of a specific category of demonic activity they had identified. The clarity of the case for them lay in the progression, the initial reports, the medium's misidentification of the presence, the escalating physical activity, their own assessment of the demonic nature of the infestation, the blessing by the priest, the failure of the blessing to resolve the situation, the removal of the doll, the drive to Monroe, the arrival. Each step followed from the one before. The framework explained each development. The case was, in their view, coherent. The drive from Middletown to Monroe remained, in Ed Warren's account, one of the more directly eventful moments in the case. The brakes, the steering, the holy water on the seat beside him. Whether those events occurred as described, whether they occurred in some form but with a different cause, or whether memory and framework shaped the account in ways that are now impossible to verify, is not something the documentary record can resolve. What it can show is that the account is specific, that it appears consistently across multiple versions, and that Ed Warren regarded it as significant, not as evidence of supernatural power, but as evidence of what he called opposition, the entity's resistance to being moved. Monroe, Connecticut, in the early 1970s, was a quiet place. It still is, largely. It is the kind of town where a house on a residential street looks like other houses on the same street, where the street looks like other streets in the town, where the town sits in the middle of the Connecticut landscape, with no particular reason to draw anyone's attention unless someone had a reason to go there. The Warrens had a reason to be there. Obviously, they lived there, and after the drive from Middletown, the doll had a reason to be there too. It had arrived. It was inside the walls. The front door had closed behind it. Lorraine Warren lived in that house, with the doll in it. This is a detail that tends to get absorbed into the larger story without much dwelling, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment, not to generate any particular feeling about it, but simply to register what it meant in practical terms. She woke in the mornings in a house that contained, somewhere within it, an object that her husband had driven across Connecticut at risk to the vehicle, an object he regarded as the focal point of a demonic infestation. She went about her days in those rooms. The doll was somewhere in the house. The mornings came and went. Over time, the arrangement of the doll within the house evolved. The museum that would eventually house it, the Warren Occult Museum, with its collection of objects from investigated cases, its low lighting, its shelves of accumulated artifacts, was established in a converted space at the rear of the property, and the Annabelle doll would eventually take up residence there in the locked glass case that became its permanent home. But in those early months and years in Monroe, it simply existed in the house, in whatever keeping the Warrens judged appropriate for it. While the case was recorded, the accounts were written down, and the broader story of the Middletown apartment and what had been found there began to solidify into the documented form that would appear a decade later in print. The Demonologist reached readers in 1980 well. The Annabelle case, by that point, had been settled. The doll was in Monroe. The museum had taken shape. The framework had been applied, and the conclusions recorded. The book made the case available to a wider audience for the first time in its full form. Before that, the Warrens had discussed it in lectures and talks, but the detailed account appeared in print with Brittle's publication. From 1980 onward, the case existed in two forms simultaneously: the physical fact of the doll behind glass in Monroe, and the printed account in The Demonologist, which carried the story wherever readers carried it. Lorraine Warren continued to discuss the case for the rest of her long life, in interviews, in public appearances, in the museum tours she led for visitors who came to Monroe specifically to see the cabinet and the doll inside it. Her account remained consistent over decades. The details she returned to, the specific moments she emphasized, the conclusions she drew, these did not shift materially from one telling to the next, which is itself a documented pattern worth noting without interpreting too heavily in either direction. Ed Warren died in 2006. The museum continued under Lorraine's care. The doll remained in its case. The case file remained part of the Warren archive. The house in Monroe remained the house in Monroe. The framework the Warrens had built over their lifetimes remained after Ed's death, carried forward by Lorraine in the interviews and tours and conversations that continued until her own death in 2019. What the two of them had produced across those decades was a specific and internally consistent account of an ordinary object, a department store children's toy from the early 1970s, and what they believed it to contain. The account is documented. The framework is documented. The object still exists. The car made the drive. The front door closed. And whatever was inside the doll, if anything was, passed through the door of the house in Monroe and came to rest in a space that would hold it for the next 5 decades and beyond. The house still stands on its residential street. Monroe is still quiet. The drive from Middletown still takes about an hour. And the doll that was carried through the front door of the Warrens' home on that particular day in the early 1970s, wrapped and transported and brought across the middle of Connecticut by a man who believed he understood what he was carrying, arrived at a house where it would stay, behind glass, under a handwritten warning, in the keeping of 2 people who had devoted their lives to the study of exactly this kind of thing. It arrived. The car was parked. The house received it, and the ordinary street outside continued to be ordinary, the way streets do, regardless of what is kept behind the doors that face them. At the back of a private house on Young's Inn Road in Monroe, Connecticut, there was a room that did not look like much from the outside. The house itself was an ordinary suburban property, a driveway, a yard, the kind of quiet residential street where the same families have lived for a long time, and the neighbors know each other's cars. The room at the back was accessible through a side entrance, and depending on the year and who was giving the account, it was described as a converted annex, an attached structure, a dedicated space set apart from the main living areas of the house. What it contained, once inside, was another matter entirely. The Warren Occult Museum was not a commercial operation in the ordinary sense. It was a private collection housed on private property, open by appointment, and for many years it was Lorraine Warren herself who led visitors through it. She had accumulated the objects in it across decades of investigation, physical artifacts from cases that she and her husband Ed had worked, items that by their accounting had been associated with reported paranormal activity and were now kept in a space that had been prepared. Through a combination of religious practice and physical precaution to house them. The room was low and close and full. There were shelves and cases and objects that in any other context would have seemed ordinary. In that room, the accumulation of them produced something else. Not alarm, precisely, but a kind of concentrated attention. The sense that the objects had histories that the room itself was holding. Among those objects, positioned so that it could be seen from the doorway, was a locked glass cabinet. Inside the cabinet sat a Raggedy Ann doll. The cabinet itself was not large. It was custom built by most accounts, and it sat at a particular place in the room with the quality of something that had been placed deliberately and then not moved. The glass was clear enough to see through. The doll inside was visible, its red yarn hair, its soft fabric body, the stitched features of its face, sitting in whatever position it occupied at the time, slightly off-center, slightly settled. The case was kept locked. Along the front of the case, and on or near its frame, there were warning signs. One of them read, in language that Lorraine Warren repeated consistently across many years and many interviews, warning, token's name, positively do not open. Another advised visitors not to touch the glass. The signs were handwritten. Their tone was plain and without elaboration. They stated what they stated and offered no further explanation. Lorraine Warren had arranged for a Catholic priest to bless the cabinet. This was not incidental to how she and Ed understood the enclosure. It was in their framing as central to the containment as the lock and the glass. The physical structure of the case and the religious sanctification of it were understood as working together, as parts of a single precaution. The blessing was not a ritual performed once and then set aside. It was part of the ongoing condition of the cabinet's presence in the room, something that had been done to the space that the object now occupied, and that, in their framework, remained part of what the space was. There is a quality to old institutional warnings that is different from new ones. A freshly printed sign reads as provisional, adjustable, recently decided. A sign that has been in place for a long time, that has seen many visitors move past it, and many seasons change outside the window, reads differently. The warning signs on the Annabelle cabinet, by the time the museum had been open for a decade, had that quality. They were not alarming in the way a new alarm is alarming. They were settled. They had been there long enough to become part of the room. Visitors read them and then looked through the glass at the doll inside, and the doll sat where it sat, soft and familiar, its yarn hair the particular red that Raggedy Ann yarn hair has always been, its stitched smile unchanged. The room had low lighting. This is consistent across most accounts from people who visited the museum in the years it operated. Not darkness, not theatrical dimness, but the kind of low ambient light that belongs to a space full of objects that do not require clear illumination to be seen. Visitors moved through it at whatever pace Lorraine Warren set, and she was, by most descriptions, a composed and attentive guide, specific about the histories of what the room contained, careful in how she spoke about it, not performing alarm and not inviting it. She had spent many years in that room. The objects in it were familiar to her in the way that anything becomes familiar after long acquaintance. She spoke about the Annabelle cabinet, the way someone speaks about something they have spent a great deal of time considering. The museum drew a particular kind of visitor, people who had heard about the cases, people who had read the books, people who found in reported paranormal incidents the kind of open, unresolved quality that makes sustained attention feel worthwhile. Monroe, Connecticut is not a long drive from several large population centers. The museum was not easy to access in the way a commercial attraction is easy to access, but it was reachable, and for decades people reached it. They made appointments. They drove out along the suburban roads. They came through the side entrance and entered the room where the objects were, and at some point in the tour, they found themselves standing in front of the locked glass cabinet with the warning sign on the front, looking at the doll inside it. What they reported from that proximity will be covered more fully in what follows. But there is something worth noting here, before those accounts accumulate, about the physical fact of the room and the cabinet as a place. The warnings were real signs on a real case. The blessing had been performed by a real priest. The lock was a real lock. These were material facts about a specific room in a specific house in Monroe, Connecticut. Not interpretations of the room, not claims about what the room contained or what it meant, but the straightforward physical inventory of what was there and how it had been arranged. A glass cabinet, a lock, a handwritten warning, a doll inside, a room around it, low and still, with the accumulated objects of decades of reported cases on all sides. Lorraine Warren first began telling the story of the young man in the cabinet in the years shortly after the doll had been installed in the museum. The account was consistent across the many times she repeated it, across interviews and talks and the tours themselves. A young man, she said, had visited the museum. He had stood before the Annabelle cabinet and dismissively had slapped the glass. He had taunted the doll, spoken to it in terms that communicated contempt or challenge, the specifics varying slightly between tellings, but the action and its quality remaining the same. He had not been warned by her quickly enough to prevent this, or he had dismissed the warning, or he had simply done what he intended to do before a warning could be offered. Later that same day, she said, the young man was killed in a motorcycle accident on Route 44 in Connecticut. Lorraine Warren told this story consistently over the course of many years. It appeared in accounts of museum visits. It circulated in the communities of people who followed paranormal cases closely. It became, in time, one of the defining stories attached to the cabinet, not part of the original case documentation, not part of the demonologist, but a piece of the museum's own accumulated account of what the cabinet was and what proximity to it had produced. She presented it without escalation. She did not frame it as a demonstration or a warning aimed at her visitors in the conventional sense. She told it plainly, with the quality of someone recounting something they had witnessed and continued to hold as significant. The account has not been independently verified. There is no external documentation, no news report, no accident record made public, no corroborating source that establishes the connection between the museum visit and the accident. What exists is Lorraine Warren's account, repeated across decades, consistent in its shape, that is its documentary status. Whether the events she described occurred as she described them, and whether the connection she drew between them reflects what actually happened, are questions the record does not resolve. The account is part of the history of the cabinet, of the specific object, and the specific room in Monroe, in the sense that it was told and retold there, in that room, to visitors who stood in front of the glass and listened. It belongs to the texture of the place. There are small things about the museum that recur across visitor descriptions from different periods. The quality of the light, already noted, the closeness of the shelves, the particular way the Annabelle cabinet was positioned so that it could be seen from the entrance to the room before a visitor had reached it, a distance at which the doll was visible as a shape and a color through the glass before its features were clearly legible. The handwriting on the warning signs, which several visitors noted had the quality of something written carefully rather than quickly, deliberate letter forms, unhurried. The temperature of the room, which some visitors described as cooler than the rest of the house, though this is the kind of detail that is difficult to disentangle from expectation in a space that has been framed as it had been framed. Lorraine Warren died on April 18, 2019, at the age of 92. She had been the museum's primary steward for its entire operational life, the person who had arranged the objects in it, who had led the tours, who had spoken to visitors about the histories of what the room contained, who had repeated the accounts that accumulated around each object across the years the museum was open. Ed Warren had died in 2006. In the years between his death and hers, Lorraine Warren had continued to give tours and to speak about the cases, including the Annabelle case, with the consistency and specificity that had always characterized her public accounts of it. After April 2019, the museum was no longer open to the general public in any regular or organized sense. The property remained in the possession of the Warren family and their associates. Tony Spira, Lorraine's son-in-law, had long been involved in the management of the Warren cases and estate. But the tours stopped. The appointments no longer filled the appointment book. The room at the back of the house in Monroe, which had received visitors for many years, went quiet. The glass cabinet remained. The doll remained inside it. The warning signs remained on the front of the case. The lock remained locked. The blessing that had been performed on the cabinet remained in the Warren framework as part of what the cabinet was, a condition of its existence in that space, not something that had expired or been withdrawn. The case file, the documentation of the original investigation, and the decades of museum accounts remained as the record of what had been claimed and observed and reported about the object. What the room looks like now, with no tours being conducted and the house quiet around it, is not something that has been publicly described in any systematic way. The accounts that exist from visitors in the years before Lorraine Warren's death describe a room that was particular and full and maintained. What that room has become in the years since, whether it has remained as it was, whether the objects have been moved or reorganized or placed in other care, has not been confirmed in the public record. The cabinet, if it remains where it was, is now in a room that no one is being led through. The warning signs face an empty room. The doll inside the sealed glass sits in whatever position it currently occupies, in a house that no longer has a tour schedule, on a street in Monroe that is the same quiet street it has always been. There is something particular about objects that were made to be seen by many people and then are no longer. The museum, while it operated, was a space for sustained attention, a place where people arrived intending to look carefully at the objects it contained, to stand before the cases and consider them, to receive the histories that Lorraine Warren offered, and then carry those histories away. The Annabelle cabinet, in that operational context, was something that received regular human attention. Visitors came to it. They stood before it. They looked at the doll through the glass. Some of them placed their hands near the warning sign. Some of them read the sign aloud to companions. The cabinet was, in that sense, an active object, not in the contested sense that the Warrens attributed to it, but in the simpler sense that it was the destination of deliberate human attention across many years. When the tours stopped, that quality changed. The cabinet became, at least in external fact, an unvisited object in an undisturbed room. This is not an unusual condition for many objects in many rooms. It is in fact the condition of most objects most of the time. But for a cabinet that had been built to be looked at, positioned to be visible from the doorway, equipped with signs that addressed a visitor's gaze, the absence of visitors is its own kind of note in the record. The glass case, the locked latch, the handwritten warning on the front, the doll inside it, soft and fabric, its red yarn hair, the same shade it has been since it arrived in Monroe, and was carried through the front door of the Warrens' house and placed at some point in the cabinet that had been prepared for it. The room around the cabinet, the shelves, the low light, the other objects accumulated from other cases over other years, quiet now and dark, and no longer receiving the particular attention it was built to receive. The Warren Occult Museum was never accredited, never academic, never institutional in any formal sense. It was a private collection in a private home, organized and maintained by two people who had spent their adult lives investigating cases that existed at the outer edge of what any institution had formally recognized as subject matter. The legitimacy it had was the legitimacy of the Warrens themselves, their decades of fieldwork, their extensive case files, the consistency of their accounts across many years and many platforms. Whether what the museum contained was what the Warrens said it was, and whether the cases that produced the objects were what the Warrens said they were, are questions the museum itself could not resolve and was never designed to resolve. It was not a research institution. It was a room of things. The Annabelle cabinet was the most visited object in that room for the years when the film franchise had expanded public awareness of the case. After The Conjuring was released in 2013 and the Annabelle films followed, visitors arrived who had not previously known the details of the original case, who came because they had seen a version of the story on screen and wanted to see the object at its center. Those visitors found what all the earlier visitors had found: a glass case, a locked latch, a warning sign, a soft fabric doll with red yarn hair sitting slightly off-center inside the sealed enclosure. The gap between the porcelain figure from the films and the actual Raggedy Ann in the case was, for many of these visitors, the first thing that needed accounting for. The real object was quieter than the screen version. It was smaller. It was more familiar. It looked through the glass exactly like what it was, a standard Raggedy Ann doll from the late 1960s or early 1970s, the kind of object that was once widely owned, widely given as gifts, widely regarded as a comfortable and wholesome presence in a child's room. That familiar quality is something the Warrens spoke about directly in relation to the case. The ordinariness of the object was not incidental to what they understood about it. It was, in their framework, central to how the case had developed. The familiarity of the doll, its associations with comfort and childhood, and the uncomplicated affection that children's toys carry, was part of what had made the original situation in the Middletown apartment possible. An unfamiliar object, something strange-looking or overtly unsettling, would have been easier to remove. The doll, looking as it did, looking exactly as any Raggedy Ann doll had ever looked, was the kind of object a person instinctively kept. That instinct, in their analysis, was what the situation had used. Whether that analysis reflects something real about the case, or is a framework imposed retrospectively on events that had other explanations, or no explanation, is not a question the cabinet answers. The cabinet is a glass case with a warning sign in a quiet room. The doll is a soft fabric figure with red yarn hair. These are the fixed material facts of what is there. Everything else, the case history, the Warrens' framework, the accumulated visitor accounts, the tours that Lorraine Warren led for many years, is the record of what people said about it and around it and in its presence over a long period of time, in a particular room on a particular road in Monroe, Connecticut. The side entrance to the museum is presumably still there. The door that visitors came through, the path from the driveway to the entrance, the step up into the converted space, these are structural facts about a building that continues to stand. Whether anyone now comes through that door and into the room where the cabinet is, and whether the cabinet is as it was, and whether the doll is still inside it, are things that have not been confirmed. Lorraine Warren's death in April 2019 was publicly noted and widely reported, and the fact that the museum was no longer operating in its prior form was acknowledged. But the specific fate of the cabinet and its contents, whether the object has been moved, whether it remains in place, whether the case is still locked and the sign still facing forward, belongs to the unconfirmed portion of the record. This is not an unusual condition for objects in cases of this kind. The documentation of an investigation tends to be thorough at the point of the investigation and thinner at the margins. What the case file contained at the time of its creation does not automatically include what happened afterward in the long quiet that follows the period of active attention. The Annabelle case file, as a document, is a record of what was reported and investigated in the early 1970s and of the object's subsequent decades in the museum. What the object's condition is now, in the years following the museum's effective closure, is not a question the case file is designed to answer. The room at the back of the house in Monroe was for a long time a place where something specific was being maintained, not just physically contained, maintained in the sense that Lorraine Warren brought her attention to it regularly, kept the blessing active in her understanding of it, spoke about it to visitors in ways that kept its history alive and present in the space. An object in a room that is regularly attended to is a different thing, in some ambient sense, from an object in a room that is not. This is true of any object in any room. A painting in a gallery that is open and visited has a different quality of presence than the same painting in a closed storage facility. The attention directed at an object is itself a kind of condition of the object's existence in a space. The Annabelle cabinet, in the years when the museum was operating, received that attention continuously. Visitors came. Lorraine Warren stood beside it and spoke. The warning sign faced forward. The glass was clear. The doll was visible. Now the room is quiet. The door that visitors came through is not being opened on a regular schedule. The attention that maintained the room as a visited, inhabited space has changed. The cabinet stands in whatever state it stands in. The doll is inside it, presumably in whatever position it occupies. The warning sign still faces the room. This is not a confirmed fact in the sense that someone has gone recently into the room and reported back. It is the reasonable conclusion from what is known about the museum's physical condition in the period immediately following Lorraine Warren's death, which was that the room was undisturbed and the objects in it remained in place. The sign, if it remains as it was, faces an empty room in Monroe, Connecticut. Its instruction, do not open, do not touch the glass, do not provoke, addresses no one. The room is quiet. The house is still on its street. Outside, the Connecticut seasons continue in their usual order. The gray winters along the suburban roads, the long spring, the still summer evenings, the particular quality of autumn light that comes to that part of New England in September and October when the air changes and the trees begin to turn. The doll sits behind the glass in whatever season it currently is. It has been in that case, by the best available accounting, for more than 50 years. It came to Monroe as an object that had already been in Middletown for a year or more, and before that it had been in a hobby store, and before that it had been wherever it had been, a standard mass-produced Raggedy Ann from the late 1960s, soft and fabric and entirely familiar, entirely consistent with its kind. It arrived in Monroe and was placed in the cabinet that had been prepared for it, and the cabinet was locked, and the warning signs were placed, and the blessing was performed, and for more than 50 years the room received visitors who came to look at the object through the glass. That is the particular history of a particular room in a particular house. The glass case, the locked latch, the handwritten sign, the doll visible through the glass, its red yarn hair unchanged, its stitched smile, the same smile it has always had, sitting in the quiet of the Monroe Museum room in whatever year it currently is, the warning sign facing forward, the case sealed, the room around it still. A particular cluster of words appears again and again across the accounts people left after visiting the Warren Occult Museum in Monroe, Connecticut. Pressure, heaviness, watched. The words come from different years, written by different hands, recorded in different formats, a handwritten note in a visitor log, a paragraph posted to a personal blog in the mid-2000s, a spoken comment captured on a phone in 2014, and yet they tend to arrange themselves in roughly the same order, describing roughly the same experience. Something felt near the Annabelle cabinet, something that arrived when a person approached the glass, and that, at least in the reporting, did not follow them to other parts of the room. Lorraine Warren spoke about this pattern across many years of documented interviews. She described it carefully and consistently in the particular way she had of treating the cabinet's history as something she had been keeping careful track of for a very long time. What visitors reported, she said, was physical, not an impression, not a vague unease, but something experienced in the body, a pressure in the chest, a change in orientation, a sensation of nausea that arrived without apparent cause and eased most often when the visitors stepped back. She returned to these descriptions in interview after interview across decades, using the same measured register for each one: chest pressure, dizziness, the specific quality of a room that had shifted in some way near one particular point. What makes this worth sitting with is the accumulation. A single account, offered once by a single visitor, is a curiosity at best, the kind of thing that might be explained by suggestion, by expectation, by the natural unease of standing in a room full of objects housed there for reasons that are not entirely comfortable. One person feeling a little lightheaded near an old doll in a locked case in a converted room in Monroe, Connecticut, is not a pattern. It is an afternoon, but across decades of tours, across the many hundreds of people Lorraine Warren personally led through that space, and then across the further thousands who visited in the years following 2013, the accounts kept arriving in roughly the same shape: pressure in the chest, a felt heaviness that seemed particular to the area around the case, a sense of being observed from somewhere very close. The museum's layout is worth holding in mind. Visitor descriptions from the years of the museum's operation place the Annabelle cabinet at the back of the converted room, positioned so that it was visible from the doorway, which meant that a visitor often had their first clear view of the case from some distance before they approached it. The room itself was described in visitor accounts as low lit, with a collection of other objects, framed documents, additional display cases, various items associated with other Warren investigations, arranged along the walls and on shelving. None of these other objects in the documented visitor accounts produced the same concentrated pattern of physical sensation reports that clustered specifically around the Annabelle case. The feeling for those who reported it was not distributed evenly across the space. It was located, it had a specific address inside the room, the cabinet, the locked glass, the doll behind it. Some accounts described the felt change as a quality of the air rather than a sensation in the body, a heaviness, a pressure that was not quite weight and not quite temperature, but something adjacent to both, a difference in the quality of the space immediately around the case compared to the space a few feet away from it. These are the harder accounts to hold precisely, because they describe something that language was not quite built for, and the descriptions accordingly go slightly vague at the edges, reaching for words that land in the right vicinity without quite arriving at the thing itself. Visitors wrote about the feeling of a room that was colder near the case, or thicker, or quieter in a way that a quiet room alone was not. The descriptions are consistent in their imprecision, which is itself a kind of pattern. Lorraine Warren's account of what she observed over the years of the museum's operation added a specific detail that sits outside the range of atmospheric impression. She stated, across multiple recorded interviews and in consistent terms, that the Annabelle doll had been found in positions within the locked, sealed glass cabinet that differed from where it had last been placed. Not dramatically different, in the way of a doll moved from one side of a shelf to another. Subtly different, a slight rotation of the body, a change in the angle of the head, an arm that appeared to have shifted from a position documented in the previous visit. She recounted, specifically, that the doll had been found on the floor of the cabinet's interior without the case having been opened. This was an account she returned to across the decades of the museum's operation without significant variation, treating it as one of the straightforward observable facts of the case, not the most dramatic fact, not offered as climax, but simply part of the record she was keeping. There is no independent verification of these accounts of the doll's movement within the case. The reports come from Lorraine Warren and from visitors who were not in a position to observe the cabinet over a period of time in the way she was. What the accounts constitute, taken together, is a consistent testimony from a single long-term observer about an object she watched closely over many years. The consistency of her account, the same detail offered in the same terms across different interviewers in different decades, is its own kind of fact, whatever it does or does not establish about the doll's behavior inside the sealed glass. Ed Warren's framework for understanding the Annabelle case rested on a specific position about why entities, in his model, chose the objects they chose. He articulated this position at length in his interviews and in the material collected in Gerald Brittle's 1980 account of the case. Demonic entities, Warren argued, operated with a degree of deliberateness. They did not occupy objects randomly. They selected objects that carried emotional weight for the people around them, children's toys, familiar household items, objects with the quality of comfort and unthreatening familiarity that made them easy to overlook, easy to accept, easy to keep close. The selection, in his framework, was strategic. The entity understood or functioned as if it understood that a person would be far less likely to remove from their home an object they associated with warmth in childhood than an object they found immediately disturbing. The Annabelle case was, for Ed Warren, among the clearest examples of this pattern in their entire catalog of investigated cases. A doll that was soft and red-haired and stitched and smiling, universally regarded as wholesome, kept on a bed in a nursing student's apartment, precisely because it was the kind of thing no one would think twice about having nearby. This framework was Ed Warren's, shaped by decades of work that operated within a specific theological and investigative tradition. It is not a framework that can be evaluated outside that tradition in any straightforward way. What it constitutes in the record is a coherent internal logic, a set of proposed connections between the choice of object, the nature of the reported activity, and the progression of the case as the Warrens understood it. Whether the logic maps onto something actual is a question the documented record does not answer, and what the documented record holds is the framework itself, deliberate object selection, emotional familiarity as the mechanism, the Annabelle doll as the instance that Warren described as most clearly exhibiting the pattern. The accounts from visitors who arrived in the years following 2013 are worth distinguishing, at least briefly, from the accounts that preceded that year. After The Conjuring was released, the Warren Occult Museum received a substantially larger number of visitors than it had in previous years. many of them arriving specifically because of the film and specifically seeking out the Annabelle cabinet. This created a different visiting population, one that arrived with a more fully formed prior image of the doll and its attributed history than earlier visitors had possessed. The question of how prior expectation shapes reported physical sensation is a genuine one in the research literature on suggestion and priming, and it applies here. A visitor who had recently watched a horror film about a doll associated with violent supernatural activity, and who then stood in front of a locked glass case bearing a warning sign and a doll with a history, was not in the same observational situation as a visitor arriving for a general tour of the museum with less specific foreknowledge. And yet the accounts from the post-2013 period reproduce, with considerable fidelity, the same cluster of described sensations that appear in accounts from years before the film existed. Chest pressure, a felt heaviness near the cabinet, the sensation of being watched. These words appear in visitor blogs and informal accounts from the early 2000s, from the 1990s, from the years when the museum was a much smaller and much more locally known enterprise that received visitors primarily through personal referral and word of mouth. The same words appear in accounts from visitors who arrived in 2014 and 2015, armed with a much more vivid and cinematically detailed prior image of what the doll was supposed to be. The pattern, in other words, appears to predate the cultural machinery that could most easily be cited to account for it. That is not an explanation in either direction. It is simply what the record shows. The cabinet itself is a specific object, and the physical description that survives across visitor accounts and documented photographs is worth holding precisely. A locked case, taller than wide, built to contain the doll at roughly eye level for a standing adult. Glass on the front, allowing a clear view of the interior. A warning sign affixed to or immediately near the case, visible from the doorway at the far end of the room. Inside the case, the Raggedy Ann doll, soft, approximately 18 inches, red yarn hair, stitched face, sitting in whatever position it currently occupied. The positions having been a matter of some documented variation over the years, according to Lorraine Warren's account. The case was described in multiple accounts as having been blessed by a Catholic priest, with the Warrens treating this sanctification as a meaningful component of the containment rather than a supplemental gesture. The religious framing of the physical structure was part of how they understood what the structure was for. Visitors who described the physical sensation reports in the most specific terms tended to locate the feeling precisely, not distributed across the cabinet as a whole, but intensified at a particular point, often in front of the center of the glass. This is a pattern that appears across accounts from different periods and different visiting conditions, which is notable because it is the kind of specific detail that becomes less reliable under the influence of broad cultural suggestion, not more. A general cultural suggestion that the doll is threatening might produce a generalized feeling of unease in the room. What the accounts more often describe is something more located, a quality of pressure that was identified at a specific point in space, immediately in front of the case, and that was described as easing when the visitor moved back or to either side. Some visitors described the sensation as arriving without warning. They had walked through the room, past other cases and objects, and then encountered something near the Annabelle cabinet that registered as a physical rather than an emotional event, a pressure that was not anxious in quality, not exactly fearful, but distinct, the way a change in altitude or barometric pressure is distinct from the feeling of being in an unchanged environment. Others described a gradual thickening as they approached, a progressive quality to the feeling that made it possible, in retrospect, to identify the point at which the sensation had started. These two kinds of account are different enough to suggest that what people were describing, whatever its source, was not a simple uniform experience shared by everyone who entered the room. The variation is consistent with what one would expect from a range of individuals responding to a specific environmental stimulus, whether that stimulus was primarily physical, primarily psychological, or something else that those categories do not quite capture. Lorraine Warren spoke about the cabinet with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who had been in the room a great many times and had stopped finding the cabinet remarkable in the way a first-time visitor might. In her telling, it was simply part of the house, an object she lived alongside, something she had arranged to have properly housed and properly blessed and properly signed, and something she checked on as a matter of routine. She described the doll as not dangerous in the sense of being unpredictable or erratic, but as something that required the kind of stable, consistent management that the cabinet and its blessing were designed to provide. There was no alarm in her account. There was the calm, practical air of someone who had made a long-term arrangement with an unusual situation and found the arrangement over the decades to be holding. The accounts of dizziness, the visitors who stepped back from the case feeling disoriented, who described the sensation as similar to standing up too quickly or turning around too fast, cluster in the documentation as well. These reports are more readily assigned to known physiological mechanisms than some of the other reported sensations. Dizziness in an enclosed, low-lit room experienced by a visitor who is standing still and concentrating their attention on a fixed point is not beyond what the vestibular system might produce under those conditions without any unusual external input. This is the honest edge of what the physical accounts allow. The dizziness reports are real in the sense that the people who made them experienced something they called dizziness. What produced it? The room, the concentration, the expectation, something else. The documentation does not establish. The chest pressure accounts are harder to assign. Pressure in the chest, arriving without obvious physical cause in a person who was not otherwise unwell, and easing when the person moved away from the specific location near the cabinet. This is a more specific report than generalized unease, and it recurs across the documented accounts with enough regularity that it constitutes part of the pattern rather than an exception to it. Visitors described it as a slight tightening, a sense of weight across the sternum, something that was noticed rather than felt as distressing in most accounts. The majority of the people who reported it continued their visit. Most of them described it afterward in the curious, rather than the frightened register, as a detail of the experience that had been interesting to notice, that they felt worth recording in whatever form they chose to record their visit. The sensation, in other words, was not, for most of those who reported it, a disturbing or frightening experience. It was simply something that happened near the case and that stayed in the account because it had been particular enough to notice. The sense of being watched is perhaps the most consistently reported element across the full span of visitor accounts, and it is also the most obviously subject to the shaping effects of the environment. A room that has been designed, however informally, however incrementally, around the presence of a specific object with a specific attributed history, is a room that has been arranged, at least in part, to produce a particular quality of attention in the people who enter it. The warning sign, the locked glass, the low light, the position of the cabinet at the back of the room, visible from the doorway. These are the elements of an environment that has been organized around the idea of watchfulness, the idea that the object inside the case is something to be watched, and perhaps something that watches in return. that the reported sensation of being observed reproduces the structure of the environment in which it is reported is on one reading exactly what one would expect. On another reading, it is simply consistent with something that was there. What the full body of visitor testimony constitutes, taken as a whole, is a documented pattern of self-reported experience associated with a specific place and a specific object across a span of several decades. It does not constitute evidence of any particular mechanism. It does not establish the source of what people reported feeling. What it does establish is that the pattern existed, that it was reproduced across different visiting conditions and different cultural moments, and that Lorraine Warren tracked and described it with a consistency that is itself part of the documented record. The accounts survive as accounts. They have been recorded in various formats with various degrees of detail by a large number of people who had no particular reason to coordinate their descriptions, and they arrived at roughly the same cluster of words: pressure, heaviness, watched with a regularity that the documentation allows to be observed. There is a particular quality to the guest book image that the accounts collectively produce. Not a literal guest book in most cases, but a dispersed archive of individual records, blogs, YouTube comments, forum posts, informal paranormal tourism documentation, the occasional handwritten note in the museum's own visitor log for the years when such a log was kept. Each individual entry is small. Each describes a specific afternoon, a specific visit, a specific person standing in front of a specific cabinet in a converted room in Monroe, Connecticut, and noticing something they felt worth noting. Taken one at a time, they are individual experiences, particular, local, belonging to the person who had them. Taken together over decades, they form something else, a long, layered, slightly irregular record of a consistent human response to a specific place. The repetition in these accounts is not the repetition of people copying each other, or not obviously so. The accounts from before the widespread availability of digital documentation are too scattered and too individually voiced to suggest coordination. What they suggest, more simply, is that something about the space near the Annabelle cabinet produced, in a wide variety of different visitors, across a wide variety of different years, roughly the same set of reported sensations. Whether that consistency reflects something about the cabinet, something about the doll, something about the cumulative effect of an environment arranged around a particular idea, or some combination of those things that does not reduce to any single one of them. The documentation does not say. It simply records what was reported, and what was reported keeps arriving in roughly the same form. The Warren framework proposed that the entity associated with the doll was not passive. Ed Warren was specific about this in his interviews and in the material compiled in the Brittle account. The reported movements of the doll within the sealed cabinet, the reported physical sensations of visitors near the glass, the consistent documentation of a felt change in the quality of the space around the case. All of this, in Warren's model, reflected an ongoing presence, something that continued to occupy the object and to make itself perceptible to the people who approached it. This was not, in Warren's telling, a residual impression left by past events and playing out on a loop. It was something that was still there, still present, still capable of producing effects in the physical environment. The case was not closed in his view, it was contained. Those two things, for the Warrens, were not the same. Whether anything is contained in the glass cabinet in Monroe, Connecticut, whether the locked case houses something other than a soft fabric doll sitting in whatever position it currently occupies, is a question the documented record does not settle. The record holds the reports of the people who visited and felt something, the account of Lorraine Warren, keeping careful watch over many decades. The framework of Ed Warren proposing a mechanism for what the reports described, and the long accumulation of human testimony that arrived across 50 years of varying circumstances in roughly the same form. These things are in the record. They are what the case at this level consists of. The museum fell quiet after April 2019. The tours that Lorraine Warren had led personally for so many years, walking small groups through the converted room and describing the history of each object in the careful, matter-of-fact manner she had developed over decades, stopped being scheduled in a regular way. The cabinet remained in place. The warning sign remained on the case. The doll remained inside it, in whatever position it occupied when the last tour group departed, the case locked as it had been locked for most of the preceding 50 years, the blessing on the glass and the structure still there, in whatever form blessings persist. The visitor accounts stopped accumulating in the way they had during the museum's years of operation, not because the doll ceased to exist, or the cabinet, or the room, but because the room was no longer being entered in the same way, by the same volume of people, with the same accumulating record of what they reported feeling. The archive of human response closed itself, in the way archives do when the activity that generates them comes to a quiet stop. What remains in the archive is what was recorded up to that point. The pattern, the cluster of words, the long sequence of individual afternoons in a converted room in Monroe, each person noticing what they noticed and describing it in whatever form they had available. The doll is still there. That much is established. The cabinet is still in place, in the converted room at the back of a house in Monroe, Connecticut, in a space that was built around it and that has been undisturbed in the main since the last tours were given. The warning sign is on the case. The glass is locked. Inside the case, the fabric figure sits in whatever position it currently occupies, the position it was in the last time the case was opened, or perhaps, according to the account that Lorraine Warren gave consistently across decades of interviews, some other position arrived at by means the documentation does not establish and the sealed case does not explain. Monroe is a quiet town. The streets around the Warrens' property are ordinary suburban streets. Houses, trees, the particular stillness of a residential area in the early hours when very little is moving. The converted room at the back of the property sits within that stillness. Dark now, the museum lights off, no visitors standing in the doorway or moving toward the cabinet with the particular attentive quality that the experience of approaching the case apparently produced in the people who made it. The room is just a room at this hour, with its objects in their cases and its warning sign on the glass and its doll inside a locked cabinet that has not been opened for some time, and the accounts that filled the dispersed archive of visitor testimony over 5 decades are still there too, in whatever formats they were recorded. Blog posts that still load when the address is typed in, forum threads on servers that have not been decommissioned, YouTube videos filmed on phone cameras in 2014 and 2015, handwritten notes in whatever physical logs survive. The recurring words still sit inside those records: pressure, heaviness, watched, written by different people in different years, after different afternoons, in the same converted room, standing a few feet from the same locked glass case, describing something they noticed and felt worth putting down. The accounts continue to accumulate in the passive sense. They exist in the archive. They remain in the record. They have been there long enough now to constitute a pattern that does not require any further entries to be visible. The cabinet in the empty museum, in whatever stillness it currently occupies, holds all of that without holding anything more. The glass, the warning sign, the doll inside the sealed case, These are the things the record confirms are there. What else may be there, or may have been there, across the years when people arrived and stood in front of the glass and reached for words like pressure and heaviness and watched, that remains what it has always been in this case, reported, documented, consistent, and quietly open. In 1915, Johnny Grewell sat at a drawing table with a worn cloth doll in front of him, a soft, faded thing his daughter Marcella had found tucked somewhere in the family attic, and began tracing the shape of a face. The face he drew was simple: round cheeks, a small triangle of a nose, eyes that were flat and dark and friendly in the way that uncomplicated things are friendly, without effort, without guile. The hair he gave her was yarn, rendered in red, and the smile he stitched across the cloth of her expression was fixed and mild and did not change with the light or the hour or the mood of the room. What emerged from that drawing table in 1915 was a design so plain and so immediately legible as harmless that it would find its way into more than a century of American childhoods without ever accumulating the kind of strangeness that attaches to older or more elaborate things. It was simply a doll. It was simply familiar. That was the whole intention, and for a long time, that was the whole of what it was. Grell trademarked the Raggedy Ann character in 1915 and introduced the commercial doll 3 years later, in 1918. The storybooks followed. The design was consistent: the yarn hair, the striped fabric body, the stitched face, and the figure moved through American homes with the unhurried, unobtrusive steadiness of an object that belongs everywhere it is placed. By the mid-20th century, Raggedy Ann had been a presence in American childhood for over 30 years, and by 1970, that number had grown to more than 50. She appeared on nursery shelves and in toy chests, and on the beds of children across several generations without accumulating a particular reputation for anything other than being soft and old and recognizable and good for small hands to hold. The cultural context the doll carried into any room it entered was one of the most thoroughly unthreatening contexts an object could hold. It had been designed that way. It had remained that way across decades for most of the people who ever encountered it. The specific doll at the center of the Warren case is standard in every physical respect. Approximately 18 inches tall, soft fabric construction throughout, red yarn hair, a stitched face, the flat dark eyes, the small nose, the mild fixed smile, a striped fabric body, the same body that appeared in stores nationwide, in the same form for years on either side of 1970. There is nothing in the physical description of the doll that distinguishes it from the hundreds of thousands of other Raggedy Ann dolls produced in the same era. No unusual feature, no distinctive marking, no attribute of the object itself that would draw a second glance in any other context, on any other shelf, in any other room. The Warren case documentation and museum records confirm what the photographs of the actual doll also confirm, that the artifact is entirely ordinary in its physical form, entirely consistent with its era of mass production, entirely unremarkable as an object. What accumulated around it had nothing to do with how it was made. A department store in an American city in 1970 would have carried the doll in its toy section without ceremony. Rows of Raggedy Anns in identical packaging, their yarn hair uniform and bright under-fluorescent light, their stitched smiles identical and cheerful, each one indistinguishable from the one beside it. A mother selecting one of those dolls as a birthday gift for her daughter in Middletown, Connecticut, would have had no particular reason to pause over the choice. Raggedy Ann was safe. Raggedy Ann was known It was the right gift for a young woman who was far from home and building her life in a modest apartment with a roommate and a small collection of ordinary belongings, and a bed that needed something soft on it. The doll arrived in that apartment in the simple spirit in which it was given, a familiar object in a familiar form, carrying the uncomplicated warmth of a childhood toy into an adult space, meaning nothing more than that. That is the long background of the object, more than 5 decades of mass-produced cheerful ordinariness, stretching back to a drawing table and a worn attic doll and a designer who wanted to make something children would love without difficulty. The Warrens and others who became part of the story that followed cited this specific cultural context. The doll's deep, wide, unchallenged reputation for harmlessness as significant to how the case was understood. Ed Warren articulated in The Demonologist, published in 1980, a framework in which entities operating through objects select their objects deliberately, favoring things that carry strong emotional associations and belong to categories of the familiar and the trusted. In his framework, a children's toy was precisely the kind of object that would lower the instinct toward removal. A Raggedy Ann doll, in this account, was not an incidental detail. Its design was part of what made it, in Warren's reading of the case, the particular kind of problem it had become. Whether or not that framework holds, the cultural fact it rests on is accurate. The doll's appearance announced safety. Its appearance was, and remained, entirely true to that announcement. Nothing about the object itself contradicts the thing it was made to be. Gerald Brittle's The Demonologist, published in 1980, is a thin book with a plain cover. It carries the Annabelle account across several chapters, rendered in the Warrens' own words, as Brittle recorded them, a first-person account of what they found in the apartment, what they concluded, what they did with the doll afterward, and where it eventually came to rest. The book has been in continuous circulation since its publication. It has been revised and reissued more than once. It remains the primary printed source for the Warren account of the case, and in that sense it is a physical object that has carried this particular story for more than 4 decades, passing through many hands, sitting on many shelves, accumulating the wear of being read. There is something worth noting in the simple factual persistence of a book, that a case documented in 1980, in an account that itself rests on events from 1970, is still in print and still being read, because the questions in it were never resolved, and the object at its center is still where the Warrens left it. That object, the actual Raggedy Ann doll, not the fictional porcelain figure that appeared in movie theaters beginning in 2014, remained at the Warren Occult Museum in Monroe, Connecticut, for more than 50 years. The museum was housed on the property of the Warrens' private home, in a space described by those who visited it as a converted room or attached structure at the rear of the house. Lorraine Warren led tours of the space for many years, personally by appointment, to small groups of visitors who came from some distance to stand in a room full of objects the Warrens had collected from decades of case investigations, and to look, at some point, at the glass cabinet near the back of the room where the Raggedy Ann doll sat in a locked case with a warning sign on the front of the glass. Those tours continued for years. Then they stopped after Lorraine Warren died on April 18, 2019, at the age of 92. After that, the museum was largely closed to the general public, and the doll's precise current housing has not been publicly verified. The Hollywood films that drew wide audiences to the name Annabelle, the 2014 film, its 2017 prequel, the 2019 follow-up, each featured a different version of the story entirely. The doll at the center of the films is not a Raggedy Ann. It is a fictional antique porcelain figure, tall and cracked and dressed in white, with a face designed to read as immediately unsettling in the way that porcelain faces and cracked surfaces have read as unsettling for a long time in the visual vocabulary of horror. The backstory attached to it in the films is invented. The history given to the film's doll, the origin, the family, the events, bears no connection to the documented Warren case file or the account in The Demonologist. Licensing accounts from the film's production period indicate that Hasbro, which holds the copyright to the Raggedy Ann character, did not grant permission for the commercial use of the design, a practical constraint that produced, as a consequence, a fictional doll with a fictional history distributed to millions of people as though it were connected to an actual case. What those films named Annabelle was not the actual artifact. It was a different object for a different story. The documented artifact is still a mass-produced Raggedy Ann from the early 1970s. Red yarn hair, a stitched smile, soft fabric, approximately 18 inches tall. The photographs taken of it in the Warren Museum show an object that would be unexceptional on any shelf, in any room, in any decade, within a century's span of its manufacture. The case file that surrounds it is real in the sense that it exists and has been preserved. The Warrens' account is documented. Brittle's book is in print. The museum records exist. The visitor accounts accumulated across decades before the tours ended. All of that is on record. But the doll itself, as a physical object, gives nothing away. It holds the form it was given in 1918 and has held ever since. The red hair, the mild eyes, the fixed expression of an object made for children to love without difficulty or reservation. That is what sits in the glass case. That has always been what sits in the glass case. In the years before the museum's closure, the accumulated visitor accounts included something that appeared with enough regularity to constitute a pattern, accounts of physical sensations near the cabinet, of a quality of felt weight or pressure in the specific area of the case, of an atmosphere around that part of the room that visitors described as distinct from the rest of the museum. Lorraine Warren cited these accounts consistently across decades of recorded interviews. She also stated, across multiple separate recordings, that the doll had been found in positions within the sealed, locked case that differed from where it had last been placed, including, on at least one occasion reported in her account, on the floor of the cabinet itself. The case had not been opened. The glass was undisturbed. What was inside it had simply shifted, according to what she reported, to somewhere new. These accounts are what the visitors and Lorraine Warren said. What they describe is unresolved. It has never been satisfactorily explained, and it has never been satisfactorily replicated or confirmed by independent observation. It sits in the record the way the doll itself sits in the case, quietly, persistently, offering nothing that settles the question of what it is. What the long record of the Annabelle case amounts to in factual terms is a documented sequence of reports attached to a specific physical object, now in its 6th decade of sitting behind locked glass in a room in Monroe, Connecticut. The reports begin in a Middletown apartment in 1970 and were first set down in print in 1980. The object itself predates the reports. It was manufactured sometime before Donna Johansson's mother purchased it from a hobby store, placed it in a box, and gave it as a gift, and the design it was manufactured to carries an additional 50 years behind that, back to the drawing table and the worn attic doll and the red yarn hair that grew well fixed as the defining feature of a character that would outlast him considerably. All of that is the life of the object before the glass case. What the glass case has held since the early 1970s is an artifact that passed through a number of hands, was bought as a gift, lived in a student apartment, was carried out by Ed Warren in a car on a Connecticut road, and was installed behind glass with a signed warning and a locked front panel, and has remained there ever since, through the decades of tours and visitor accounts and the publication and republication of the 1980 book and the arrival of the films that use the name but not the object. Through all of it, the actual doll sitting in its actual case, with its actual red yarn hair and its mild fixed expression, unchanged and continuing. The distance between what the object was made to be and what became attached to it is by any measure considerable. A design created in 1915 for a worn cloth figure found in an attic. A commercial product introduced in 1918 and distributed through department stores for over a century. A birthday gift purchased by a mother for her daughter in 1970, wholesome in its intent and utterly familiar in its form, and then a case file and a glass cabinet and a warning sign facing the empty room, and decades of accumulated visitor accounts, and a book that has been in print for more than 40 years, and a film franchise that required a different doll because the actual doll was too ordinary looking to carry the weight the films needed it to carry. The gap between the object and the story that gathered around it is real, and it is wide, and it has never been adequately closed. The story did not change the object. The doll remained what it was made to be. The red yarn hair is still red yarn hair. The stitched smile is still the same mild stitched smile. Nothing about the physical form of the thing shifted across any of it. Not the apartment in Middletown, not the car on the Connecticut road, not the 50-odd years behind glass in a converted room in Monroe. The object remained ordinary. Everything else accumulated around it without touching that gap between the designed object and the accumulated account is not a gap that resolves. There is no fact on either side of it that closes it fully. The doll's physical ordinariness does not explain what the people who encountered it reported, and what they reported does not alter the physical ordinariness of the object. The Warrens' demonological framework accounts for the gap by positing something that chose the object precisely because of its ordinariness, a reading that is internally consistent and not verifiable by any external means. The visitor accounts from the museum years account for the gap by adding layers of reported experience around the glass case, layers that are consistent as a body of testimony and that do not constitute evidence in any evidentiary sense, precisely because testimony is what they are. The account in The Demonologist accounts for the gap by narrating, in Ed and Lorraine Warren's own words, a sequence of events that they found meaningful and that they committed to print and that remains in print to this day. None of these accounts closes the gap. All of them are part of the record that the gap produced. The specific phrasing that appeared on the warning sign affixed to the Annabelle cabinet, "Positively do not open," is notable for being a warning that tells the reader what not to do without explaining why, which is a specific kind of instruction. It assumes that a reader approaching the case might feel the impulse to open it. It does not offer the reader a mechanism for understanding what opening the case might produce, or why the sealed state of the case is being maintained. It simply states the prohibition in plain terms, and leaves the reader with the prohibition and the doll behind the glass, and the question that the prohibition raises by existing, which the prohibition does not answer. That sign faced the room for years. Lorraine Warren stood beside it and led tours and told the same accounts she had been telling for decades, and the sign remained on the glass, and the doll remained behind it, and the visitors who filed through the converted room in Monroe came and went and left and wrote down what they had felt in their own words, in visitor logs and online accounts and blog posts and comments, and all of that accumulated into the layered public record that the case produced. And through all of it, the doll sat in the case as it had always sat in the case, with its red yarn hair and its stitched smile and its soft fabric body that was not remarkable in any physical sense, and that was, in the Warren account, remarkable in every other sense that mattered to the people who kept it behind locked glass for more than half a century. It is the kind of object that would draw no second glance on a shelf in any other context. That is still true. The photographs confirm it. The case documentation confirms it. The physical description, 18 inches, soft fabric, red yarn hair, stitched face, could be read aloud to someone who had never seen the doll, and could be applied without error to any Raggedy Ann produced in its era. What cannot be read aloud and applied to any other doll in the same era is the accumulation of accounts that surround it, the apartment in Middletown, the notes on parchment-style paper, the Warrens' conclusion, the drive from Middletown to Monroe, the converted room, the glass case, the warning sign, the decades of visitor reports, the recorded interviews, the book, the films that did not use the actual doll, because the actual doll did not look like the thing the story had become in the cultural imagination. The cultural imagination reached for something more visually complex. The actual doll remained ordinary. That is the condition the case leaves the object in, ordinary in form, surrounded by an account that has not been resolved, sitting behind glass in a room in Monroe that is no longer open for visitors, in a house that is quieter now than it was in the years when Lorraine Warren stood beside the case and told the story she had been telling since the early 1970s. Johnny Gruelle's design lasted well past the century mark. His daughter Marcella, whose name appears in the Gruelle family accounts of how the attic doll inspired the character, died young. Gruelle family history records that she died in 1916, not long after the doll was found, and Gruelle went on to develop the Raggedy Ann stories in the years that followed, dedicating them to her. The character carried something of that dedication quietly in its origin. It was made at some level in the direction of a child who was gone, and then it passed into mass production and into department stores and into the hands of children across the country who had no knowledge of that origin and no need of it. The doll was cheerful. The doll was safe. It was designed to be held and loved without difficulty, and for most of the children who held it across the 100 and some years since its introduction, that is what it was. One of those dolls passed through a hobby store in Connecticut and into an apartment in Middletown, and out of that apartment in Ed Warren's car and into a glass case in Monroe. And that is the particular path that particular instance of the design followed, and it produced a case file and a book and a decades-long museum display and a franchise of films that needed a different doll because the actual doll was too soft, too plain, too ordinary looking to serve as the visible object of what the cultural imagination had made of the story. The actual doll stayed behind the glass. The cultural imagination moved on to something more visually legible as strange. The Monroe house stands on a quiet suburban street. The neighborhood is residential and unremarkable and looks, in any photograph or description of it, exactly like the kind of neighborhood that the character of it is. A street of houses set back from the road, trees along the sidewalk, the light changing seasonally, the way light changes everywhere in Connecticut. The museum was at the back of the property, accessible through a side door, a modest sign near the entrance. Inside, in the years when it was open, low light, objects on shelves and in cases, the accumulated artifacts of decades of Warren case investigations, and at the back of the room, positioned so it could be seen from the doorway, the glass cabinet with the Annabelle doll inside it, and the warning sign on the front, and the lock on the case. That was the room. That was what visitors came to stand in and look at. After April 2019, the tours stopped and the room became quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when the particular human energy that animated them is no longer coming through the door. The museum stopped receiving visitors. The cabinet remained in place. The doll remained inside it. The room settled into the long stillness of a space no longer being moved through by people who had come a distance to see what was in it. What remains of the Annabelle case, 50-some years on from the apartment in Middletown, is exactly what the physical record documents: a case file and a book, and a glass cabinet and an artifact. The artifact is a standard Raggedy Ann doll from the early 1970s, manufactured to a design introduced in 1918, based on a worn cloth figure found in an attic in 1915, and it has been sitting behind locked glass in Monroe, Connecticut, for most of the time since 1971 or thereabouts, inside a case blessed by a Catholic priest, behind a warning sign that says not to open it, in a room that is no longer receiving the visitors who used to file through it. The case file records what Ed and Lorraine Warren investigated and concluded. The book records what they said about it. The visitor accounts record what people reported feeling near the cabinet in the years when it was open for viewing. All of that is on record. All of it persists as a body of documented testimony attached to an ordinary object in a locked case in a quiet room in Monroe. The question the case leaves open has never been formally answered, and there is no reason to expect that it will be. The doll does not offer answers. The glass does not offer answers. The warning sign on the front of the case does not offer answers. The book does not offer answers, for all that it documents what the Warrens said and believed. The visitor accounts do not offer answers, for all that they constitute a consistent body of self-reported experience across decades. What the case offers, instead, is the kind of persistence that unanswered questions develop when they attach themselves to a specific object in a specific room and stay there, accruing over time, building a record around an artifact that remains throughout exactly what it was when it was purchased from a hobby store in Connecticut and placed on a nursing student's bed in Middletown as a birthday gift. A Raggedy Ann doll. Soft fabric, red yarn hair, a fixed, mild, unchanging smile. The glass case in Monroe holds that smile facing the room. The room is quiet now. The tours have not resumed, and no public announcement has confirmed the doll's precise current location or condition within the Warren estate, which means the last confirmed image of it is the one the museum years produced, the doll inside the sealed cabinet, the warning sign on the front, the dim room of the Warren Occult Museum around it, undisturbed and still. That image sits at the end of a line that begins with a drawing table in 1915 and a worn cloth figure in an attic and a simple round face sketched in pencil, and runs through a century of department store shelves and children's toy chests and nursery rooms and the long, uneventful life of an ordinary and widely beloved design, and then through a hobby store in Connecticut and an apartment in Middletown, and a medium and a pair of investigators from Monroe, and a car on a Connecticut road, and a converted room, and a glass case, and a book, and decades of visitors, and a film franchise that used the name, but not the object, and arrives here at the image of a locked cabinet in a quiet room in a house in Monroe, the Raggedy Ann doll inside it, the warning sign facing the empty room, the case file still on record, the accounts still accumulated and still unresolved, the object itself still sitting in whatever position it currently occupies behind the glass, holding, as it has always held, the mild fixed expression that was drawn for it at a table in 1915 by a man who wanted to make something children could love without difficulty, without reservation, without the faintest shadow of anything other than what it plainly appeared to be. The room is very still in Monroe tonight. The street outside is quiet.